The oil gap in rebound can be detected. On the car, the suspension emits a metallic noise as if the shock absorber was not tightened well onto the frame. Or testing it by hand. After pushing the rod in, if pulled out, the first part of the stroke is without resistance. Or testing the shock absorber on the test dyno. The vacuuming in extension in this case is evident. The oil gap in rebound appears when the bottom valve working in compression is softer than the piston working in compression too. This happens when the bottom valve remains open due to dirt. In this case, the shock absorber must be disassembled and cleaned perfectly. The bypass of the bottom valve and the piston are not perfectly balanced. In this case, it is necessary to reduce the area of the bypass of the bottom valve or to increase the bypass area of the piston. Suppose we have a dual tube shock absorber with an oil gap, and we found the oil gap on the car or by hand or on the dyno. At this point, the first thing is to dismount the shock absorber in all its components, to clean them, to examine each component and try to understand the reason of the problem. So first, after dismounting, we clean the piston and the rod. Then we clean even the inner cylinder, inner and outside, and we look if inside there is any scratch. And then the bottom valve. In this case, we find some chips into the bottom valve. Because the bottom valve is open and always softer than the piston. And because we have the oil gap in rebound. Unluckily, dirty is not always so evident. Very often you can detect it because hidden between the shims. In this case, we are lucky because the bottom valve is a RIV1 type made by Emetec that can be easily dismounted. So, dismounting the bottom valve, we can clean each component, remove chips, and to mount it again. But suppose that you have a bottom valve from an OE shock absorber. In this case, the bottom valve is blocked, you cannot dismount it. So the procedure is a little bit different. In next movies regarding ZF and Monroe shock absorbers, we explain how to make the remanufacturing of these bottom valves. But returning to this, we can see that we can dismount it easily, clean it, and find out that there are more chips, creating the problem. At this point, we start cleaning each component, like the bolt, the washer, the calibrator, the shims, and so on. In this case, because the problem was a chip into the bottom valve, we need to change nothing, just to clean the bottom valve. Otherwise, maybe it was needed to replace the calibrator with a new one with a smaller bypass area. In this way, the bottom valve becomes harder than the piston. The other solution is to replace the calibrator of the piston with a new one with a larger bypass area, and in this way the piston gets softer than the bottom valve. We replace all the parts, calibrator, shim, washer, then we put the rebound spring on the body of the bottom valve, and finally we close it again. We tie it without forcing. Then we mount all the parts. Hands must be always clean, as well as the components. So we put the bottom valve on the cylinder, then the oil, the piston with the rod. And we move it up and down, looking if the level of the oil in the inner cylinder remains always on the top. Because if the column of oil moves down, means that the piston in compression is harder than the bottom valve in compression and the problem has not been solved. Finally, we put the guide, the oil seal, and the thread ring. We move the rod up and down, and if any oil gap, we can pressurize. A twin tube shock absorber correctly balanced must offer a symmetric diagram respect the vertical axle, like in this case.